Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. Beneath the Waves. Chapter 1. The Descent. Dr. Aria Thornton, a marine biologist renowned for her research in deep-sea ecosystems, stood at the edge of the dock, gazing out at the vast expanse of the ocean. A mission unlike any other awaited her and her team. The newly discovered underwater cave system, located off the coast of a remote island, was said to be like nothing ever seen before. It had been hidden beneath the ocean's depths for millennia, and no human had ever set foot within its boundaries. The excitement of uncovering its secrets was almost palpable. The research vessel Nereus was ready, its state-of-the-art equipment secured, and her team was on board, each member eager to dive into the uncharted waters below. As Aria boarded, she felt a sense of both awe and trepidation. The sea had always held a certain magic for her, but the unknown was always lurking beneath the surface. Ready to make history, her assistant, Ethan, asked as he joined her on the deck. He was young, enthusiastic, and full of questions about the deep. "As ready as I'll ever be," Aria replied, her voice steady, though her mind raced with thoughts of the cave and the strange carvings reported by the initial sonar scans. The mysteries were waiting. Chapter 2. The Cave. The descent was slow and methodical. The Nereus submerged, its large hull cutting through the water, heading toward the coordinates provided by the satellite scans. The deeper they went, the darker and colder it became. Fish and other creatures, unfamiliar to Aria, flickered past the windows of the submersible, some glowing faintly in the inky blackness. After what seemed like hours, the submersible finally reached the entrance to the cave system. The walls were lined with intricate carvings, a type of artistry Aria had never seen before. The images were not of natural creatures or known marine life, but of figures that appeared to be humanoid, draped in robes, surrounded by symbols of the ocean. Waves, whirlpools, and creatures both fantastical and terrifying. "They almost look otherworldly," Ethan said, his voice a whisper, as if the carved faces might hear him. Aria studied the carvings closely. They seemed to tell a story, but the meaning was lost to time. It appeared to be a civilization that had once lived in harmony with the sea, worshipping a deity she could not understand. "Whatever this is, it's beyond anything we expected," Aria murmured. Suddenly, the submersible's lights flickered, and the calm, steady hum of the engines started to falter. Then, the communication system buzzed and crackled. "I'm getting interference," Aria said, her brow furrowing. "But there's no reason for it to malfunction this deep." The entire team's comms began to fail, leaving them isolated in the cave. Chapter 3. The Silence Below. Aria signaled for the team to continue, and they slowly ventured further into the cave, exploring its twists and turns. Strange, pulsating lights began to flicker from deeper within, illuminating the smooth stone walls. The carvings grew more complex, as if the closer they got to the heart of the cave, the more detailed the ancient designs became. Suddenly, one of the crew members, Sarah, gasped. "Look!" She pointed toward the farthest wall. A massive sculpture, partially submerged in an underground lake, loomed before them. It was a figure unlike any deity Arya had ever seen. Its face was smooth, expressionless, with long, flowing tendrils that resembled seaweed, and its eyes were hollow voids that seemed to consume the surrounding light. The air grew colder, and a heavy, suffocating silence enveloped the group. "Is it alive?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. Before Arya could respond, she heard a soft whisper, almost drowned out by the cavern's echoes. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, but then the whisper grew louder, almost as if the cave itself was alive and calling to them. The lights flickered again, and the team's comms went dead. Arya reached for the controls to check the submersible systems, but before she could, Sarah let out a loud, terrified scream. "Help!" Sarah's voice came through the intercom, but it was cut off abruptly. Arya slammed the emergency button, but the submersible systems were unresponsive. Panic began to rise in her chest. The others in the team were looking around nervously, and that's when the first of them disappeared. Chapter 4, Disappearances. It was Derek who went first. He had been standing near the rear of the submersible, staring out at the strange lighted depths. He had never seen anything like it before, and in that moment, his curiosity seemed to overtake him. With no warning, he moved toward the cave's opening, no longer with the team, as if pulled by some unseen force. "Derek, where are you going?" Arya shouted, but he didn't respond. Before anyone could stop him, he vanished into the murky darkness, swallowed whole by the depths. Panic spread like wildfire. Ethan attempted to track Derek's movements, but there was no sign of him. "He's gone," just like that. Then, one by one, each member of the team disappeared. It began with subtle signs, a fleeting shadow, a muffled scream, and the sudden loss of light. With every disappearance, the air grew thicker, colder, and the whispers, those whispers that had started out as soft and distant, now seemed to grow louder, more urgent, as though something was trying to communicate with them from the depths. Chapter 5, Alone. Arya was alone now, the submersible eerily silent except for the distant creaking of the hull. She had lost contact with everyone. The whispers still echoed in her mind, louder than ever. She knew she couldn't stay in the cave any longer. Whatever force lurked within was not done yet. She had to get out. But as she tried to reverse the submersible, the engines failed completely, leaving her stranded at the mouth of the cave. In the dim light, she saw something move in the water, something massive, undulating, and covered in scales. The sea deity, the legend she had uncovered, was not just a story. The figure began to move toward her, its tendrils reaching for the submersible. Aria's heart raced as she realized the terrible truth. This was no simple sea creature, but a sentient force of nature, a god that had been waiting beneath the waves, and it was angry. Aria's breath caught in her throat as she fumbled with the controls, her hands shaking. She slammed the emergency thrusters into reverse and shot toward the entrance of the cave, narrowly avoiding the grasping tendrils. The creature followed, but as she neared the surface, it seemed to hesitate, as if bound by some ancient rule. Aria surged forward, breaking through the water's surface and into the open ocean. The sun was setting, casting a dark red hue across the horizon. Chapter 6. The legend lives. Aria sat in the safety of the research vessel, her hands trembling. She had made it out, but the team, her friends, were gone. She had escaped, but she knew she had only seen a fraction of what the cave held. As she looked back toward the sea, the whispers still echoed in her mind, and the silhouette of the submerged cave haunted her thoughts. The sea deity, the ancient civilization, and the horrors that had lurked below the waves, they were not just legends. They were real, and now she was the last one who knew their secret. Story 2. The Eternal Carnival. Chapter 1. The Arrival. It was a Friday evening when the carnival rolled into Briarwood, a small town so quiet it felt like time itself had forgotten it. The streets were lined with old brick buildings, their once vibrant colors faded under the weight of years. The arrival of the traveling carnival was a rare event, one that caused whispers among the townsfolk. Most of them had lived here their entire lives and knew little about the carnival except that it came, set up, and left without a trace. But tonight, the air was thick with anticipation. Lena, a curious 17-year-old girl with a rebellious streak, was one of the few who dared to venture down to the fairgrounds when the first lights flickered on. She stood at the edge of the carnival grounds, watching the brightly lit tents and the towering Ferris wheel that loomed in the distance like a colossal shadow. The performers in their bright, intricate costumes were moving like clockwork, setting up their stations with an eerie precision. "You coming or what?" said Tyler, her best friend, nudging her in the ribs. Lena turned to him, her green eyes gleaming. "Of course I'm coming. What's the point of a carnival if you can't sneak in after hours?" Tyler raised an eyebrow. "You sure about this? We're not supposed to be here after dark." But Lena wasn't one to back down. What's the worst that could happen? Chapter 2. The Unseen Performers. The carnival was strange. It was more perfect than Lena had imagined, almost too perfect. As she wandered past the booths and tents, she noticed the performers never seemed to age. The clowns, with their painted faces and over-the-top smiles, appeared fresh and lively despite the fact that they had been working for hours. The acrobats moved with fluid grace, as though they had never known the weight of time or fatigue. The carousel spun endlessly, its horses, each carved with exquisite detail, gleaming under the lights. It was a dazzling sight, but as Lena and Tyler wandered deeper into the carnival, the sense of unease grew. "This place is too perfect," Tyler said, his voice low. "Have you seen how they look?" like they don't even need to rest. Lena nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the performers. Everything about the carnival seemed off. The air was too still, the rides too smooth, the laughter of the visitors too hollow. Then, as they passed the ticket booth, Lena's heart skipped a beat. The man sitting there had hollow, empty eyes, as if something had long since been taken from him. He was staring ahead, not moving a muscle, yet the ticket sales never stopped. "I'll be right back," Lena whispered to Tyler, her voice barely audible. She felt an inexplicable pull toward the booth, her curiosity getting the best of her. Chapter 3: The Midnight Escape. After a few moments, Lena found herself alone by the ticket booth. The man with the empty eyes hadn't noticed her, his gaze locked in some far-off place. Lena took a deep breath and crossed the threshold. The carnival had never been open this late, and no one had ever dared stay past midnight. But tonight, Lena was determined to explore. She slipped past the main entrance and into the heart of the carnival, her footsteps barely making a sound. The lights glowed brighter, and the hum of the rides and attractions became an eerie, rhythmic lullaby. Lena's heart raced as she made her way toward the Ferris wheel, a massive structure of steel and light. The gears were silent now, the seats empty as they slowly swayed in the wind. She couldn't resist climbing the ladder that led to the base, wanting to see the entire carnival from above. As she reached the top, the lights flickered and the wind howled through the empty seats. But that wasn't the worst part. As Lena looked down at the carnival from above, she saw something that made her stomach churn. The tents, once so inviting, now appeared to pulse with a strange energy, as if they were alive. The laughter she'd heard earlier had turned into a low, eerie moan that echoed through the air. Then something caught her eye. A figure, cloaked in black, was standing in the shadows near the tent at the far end of the grounds. The figure stepped into the light, revealing a gaunt face and hollow eyes, the same as the man at the ticket booth. Lena's breath caught in her throat. The man had followed her. Chapter 4: The Truth Unveiled. The figure didn't speak, but instead, it pointed toward the far corner of the carnival. There another figure stood, this one more familiar. "Tyler! Tyler!" Lena shouted, running toward him, but something stopped her. As she approached, she saw his face, lifeless, frozen, with a faint, ghostly smile on his lips. He didn't react when she called out to him. It was like he wasn't there at all. Lena froze in fear, realizing that something far darker was happening here. Her eyes darted to the tents, the rides, the performers. The truth was starting to become clear. The carnival didn't just perform for its audience. It fed on them. Each ride, each performance, each game was a trap. The carnival didn't exist to entertain. It existed to harvest souls. And Lena had unknowingly wandered into the heart of it. A voice, distant yet clear, spoke to her from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come here, child." Lena turned sharply. The figure in black had approached her, its voice hollow, its eyes empty voids. What are you? Lena gasped, her heart pounding. We are the carnival, the figure said, its lips stretching into an unsettling smile. And you, like all who come, are now a part of it. Once you enter, you never leave. Chapter 5, The Escape Plan. Panic surged through Lena. Her mind raced, searching for a way out. The air around her felt thick, oppressive. Her mind screamed for her to run, but where could she go? There was no escape. Every exit was guarded. Every path led back to the same haunting center. She was trapped, but then something in her gut told her not to give up. She had to find a way to break free. Her thoughts turned to the ticket booth, the man with the empty eyes. He had been there when she first arrived, and somehow his presence felt tied to the carnival's power. Lena turned and fled back toward the entrance, avoiding the performers who now moved like ghosts, their faces frozen in perpetual joy. She ducked under tents, slipping past the attractions that seemed to shift as she approached. When she reached the ticket booth, she confronted the man whose hollow eyes followed her every move. You're part of this, aren't you? Lena demanded, her voice trembling. The man didn't respond, but something shifted in the air. The carnival seemed to breathe, as if it were alive. Then, without warning, the man spoke in a low, gravelly voice. Only one can leave. Only one can break free. Lena's heart stopped. The truth was there, right in front of her. She was going to have to make a choice, a decision that would either save her or condemn her forever. Chapter 6, The Final Choice. Lena knew she couldn't stay. She couldn't become one of the performers or join the soul-sucking, endless cycle that powered the carnival. She had to escape. With one last burst of adrenaline, Lena darted through the ticket booth, bypassing the figure with the hollow eyes. She ran as fast as she could, heading toward the Ferris wheel, her only hope. The night air was sharp against her skin, and the carnival's haunting melody filled her ears. Just as she reached the Ferris wheel, she saw a flash of light, then heard a distant scream. It was Tyler, his soul trapped, forever bound to the carnival. But Lena couldn't look back. She jumped into the Ferris wheel's seat, desperately pulling the lever. The wheel spun, lifting her higher and higher, away from the clutches of the carnival below. The lights faded as she soared into the sky, leaving the cursed carnival behind. When she finally reached the edge of the town, Lena looked back one last time. The carnival had disappeared, as if it had never been there at all. But in her heart, she knew the truth. The carnival was eternal, and it would return, bringing its darkness with it. And Lena, she would never forget. Story 3, The Lake House. Chapter 1, The Escape. It had been months since Mara and James had found a weekend to themselves. Between work deadlines, family obligations, and the demands of everyday life, time together had become a luxury. So when they discovered the ad for the remote cabin by the lake, nestled deep in the woods, it seemed like the perfect escape. A place where they could unwind, disconnect from the world, and rekindle the quiet moments of intimacy that had slowly been lost in the chaos of their busy lives. The cabin was everything they had hoped for, built from dark, weathered wood. It sat perched on the edge of a serene lake, its calm waters mirroring the tall, looming trees that surrounded it. The quiet was almost too much. There were no sounds of cars, no distant hum of civilization, just the wind through the leaves and the occasional call of a bird in the distance. It was beautiful, perfect, peaceful. They unpacked in silence, each of them absorbed in the novelty of their surroundings. The day was fading into evening when Mara noticed something strange. An old, leather-bound diary lying on the coffee table in the living room. It was unassuming, the pages yellowed with age, the cover scuffed from years of use. James, who had been fiddling with the cabin's wood stove, glanced up, probably left behind by the last renters. Maybe it's some kind of guest book. Maybe, Mara replied, flipping it open. She scanned the first few pages, which seemed innocuous enough. Some people had written about their visits, describing the lake's beauty and the peace they had found. But as she turned further, the entries grew darker. Chapter 2, the first entry. The first chilling entry read, "I came here to find peace, but what I found was something far worse. The lake at night is not what it seems. Something stirs beneath the surface. Shadows, figures, emerge from the water when the moon is full. The first time I saw them, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then they came again. Tall, ghostly shapes. They move with purpose, rising from the lake, and their eyes, if you ever see them, will haunt you forever. I tried to leave, but the car wouldn't start. I tried to scream, but no sound came. And the shadows." Mara's breath caught in her throat as she read the words. She paused, glancing over at James, who was now sitting on the couch, his eyes on her. James raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "Just a diary from someone who stayed here before," she said, trying to sound casual, though the words left a cold shiver down her spine. "But listen to this." She read aloud the rest of the entry. "I thought I was losing my mind. The figures come closer each night. They knock on the windows. They scratch at the door. Their fingers are long and twisted. I'm not sure how much longer I can stay. I hear them now, tapping at the glass, waiting for me to let them in. God help me." The entry ended abruptly, a smear of ink bleeding across the final page. James chuckled nervously. Probably just some overactive imagination, right? People like to exaggerate, but Mara wasn't so sure. There was something about the diary, something in the words that made her uneasy. She closed it with a soft thud and placed it back on the coffee table, though the sense of foreboding lingered. Chapter 3, the ripple in the water. Night fell quickly in the woods. The air grew crisp as Mara and James set out a small fire in the stone fireplace and settled into the living room. The lights from the fireplace flickered against the walls, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. "It's too quiet here," Mara said, her voice low, almost to herself. No animals, no wind. It's like the forest is holding its breath. Maybe it's the isolation. I think that's what people like about this place, James replied, leaning back in his chair. He was trying to make light of it, but he too seemed uneasy. They spent the evening talking, playing cards, and drinking wine. The hours drifted by, the fire crackling as they talked about everything and nothing. But as the clock neared midnight, the strange stillness began to settle around them like a heavy blanket. Mara got up to fetch more wine, and as she reached the kitchen, she glanced out the window that overlooked the lake. The moon was full, its pale light casting a strange glow on the water's surface. And then it happened, a ripple, just beneath the surface. She squinted, her heart thudding in her chest. For a moment, she thought it was nothing, a trick of the light, a breeze disturbing the water. But then she saw it again, another ripple, larger this time, followed by a dark shadow that seemed to shift beneath the surface. "Mara, what's wrong?" James called from the other room, noticing her sudden stillness. I thought I saw something," she said, trying to sound calm, but her voice shook. She quickly stepped back from the window and grabbed her wine glass, trying to shake off the feeling of dread creeping up her spine. James came up behind her, peering over her shoulder. "It's just the lake. You've been reading that old diary too much. You're imagining things." But Mara couldn't shake the feeling. Something about the way the water moved was wrong. The shadows beneath the surface seemed to move with purpose, like they were aware of her gaze. Chapter 4. The First Knock. The night stretched on, and the unease between them grew. Mara and James tried to distract themselves, but every creak of the old house, every gust of wind outside, seemed to heighten their nerves. Finally, they decided to turn in for the night, but the atmosphere in the cabin was thick with tension. The bedroom was at the back of the house, a large window overlooking the lake. Mara lay on her side of the bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the vision of the shadowy figures beneath the water. Then there was a sound, a faint tapping. It came from the window, light, almost delicate, like fingers gently rapping against the glass. Mara's breath caught in her throat. She turned to James, her heart racing. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. James rolled over, his eyes tired. "It's just the wind, maybe a branch against the window." But as the tapping grew louder, more persistent, Mara's pulse quickened. "It wasn't the wind. I think we should check it," she said, her voice trembling. James groaned but rolled out of bed. "Fine, but if it's some animal, I swear I'm going back to sleep." They crept to the window, Mara's hands shaking as she reached for the curtains. James pulled them back slowly. There was nothing at first, just the moonlit water stretching out before them, the faint ripples shimmering in the night. But as their eyes adjusted, they saw something moving near the shore. Figures, tall, shadowy forms rising from the water, slowly creeping toward the house, their movements unnatural, like marionettes pulled by invisible strings. The figures were vague at first, barely visible, But as they drew closer, they became more defined. Pale, ghostly shapes, their features obscured by the moonlight. And then another knock. It was louder this time, and it came from the window. Mara screamed, stumbling back from the glass. James grabbed her arm, his face pale. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice tight with fear. But the figures were closer now, their faces twisted in silent, hollow expressions. They reached the window, their fingers pressing against the glass, their eyes empty, longing. Chapter 5. The Truth of the Lake. Panic surged through Mara and James. They backed away from the window, retreating to the door, but the figures were already moving around the cabin, creeping around the walls, their shadowy hands tapping and scraping at the windows. "Why are they here?" Mara gasped, her voice shaking with terror. "What do they want?" James grabbed the diary from the coffee table and opened it to the last entry. "The figures will come for you, just as they came for me. They will knock at your windows. They will scratch at your door. They hunger for your soul. The lake keeps them alive, but it is never enough. They will not let you leave. Do not stay here. Do not look into their eyes, or you will be lost forever." Mara's heart raced as she read the last, desperate words of the previous guest. The shadows outside began to shift, pushing harder against the cabin walls, as if they were trying to get in. "They want our souls," Mara whispered. "They want us to stay." The knocking grew louder, more frantic, but as they turned to leave, they realized the front door was no longer where it had been. The door frame had warped, twisting into something unfamiliar. The way out was no longer visible. Trapped. They were trapped, and the figures outside had already begun to reach for them. As the last entry in the diary warned, the lake didn't just keep them alive. It made them eternal. And now, Mara and James would become part of it. Forever. Story 4. The Forgotten School. Chapter 1. The Invitation. Max Harding had always been drawn to places forgotten by time. Abandoned hospitals, forsaken asylums, and dilapidated mansions. As an urban explorer, he sought the thrill of stepping into the forgotten corners of the world, places where no one else dared to tread. His latest obsession was an old school on the edge of town, a building that had stood silent for decades since a tragic fire had closed it down. The school was nothing more than a distant rumor in the local community. Those who remembered it spoke of the fire that had claimed the lives of teachers and students alike, trapping them inside the building in the dead of night. The tragedy had left the school in ruins, but rumors persisted that the building had never truly been abandoned. Some claimed that the spirits of the lost students and teachers still roamed its hallways, reliving their final moments. Max had heard it all, but to him, it was just another story, another mystery to uncover. His fascination with abandoned spaces overpowered his skepticism. After weeks of research, he finally found the old school hidden behind thick trees, its red brick exterior weathered by time. It was almost completely hidden from view, as if the forest itself had been slowly reclaiming it. That day, Max decided to venture inside. Chapter 2. the first step inside. The moment Max pushed open the creaking front door, he felt it, the weight of the place. A cold, eerie atmosphere seemed to settle over him as the musty air hit his face. The school had clearly been abandoned for years, yet everything inside seemed untouched, as if frozen in time. Dust covered the floors and desks, but there were no signs of vandalism. The windows were boarded up, and cobwebs stretched across the corners of the rooms. Max's flashlight cut through the darkness as he moved deeper into the school, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The halls were eerily quiet, but there was something about them that felt wrong, like the building was alive, watching him. He explored the first few classrooms. They were just as he had expected. Desks, chairs, and chalkboards all left behind. But there was something strange about them. It wasn't just the untouched nature of the rooms. It was the way they seemed to be suspended in time. Books were still stacked neatly on the shelves. A few papers lay on the desks, seemingly left as they were decades ago. The walls, though aged, still held up perfectly. Max pulled out his camera to take photos. As he focused the lens on a desk, he felt a strange shiver crawl up his spine. Something in the corner of the room moved, just a flicker of motion, something he couldn't quite place. He turned sharply, but there was nothing there. "Get a grip, Max," he muttered to himself. "It's just your imagination." But as he ventured deeper into the school, the feeling of unease only grew. Chapter 3, The Apparitions. Max had wandered for what felt like hours. The more he explored, the more the building seemed to stretch. Hallways and classrooms that shouldn't have been there. Doors that opened into nothing. But it was when he entered the science lab that things took a darker turn. The lab was just as strange as the others. Nothing seemed out of place. Yet, as Max shined his flashlight over the workstations, he noticed something unsettling. A chair near the back of the room slowly creaked. Max's heart skipped a beat. He turned to face the chair, but there was no one there. Only the faintest sound of shuffling feet, like someone moving just out of view. He stepped back, his instincts telling him to leave, but something compelled him to stay. Then, as if the building itself had answered, the air around him grew thick and heavy, like something was closing in. A soft voice echoed from the back of the room, a faint whisper that seemed to come from nowhere. "Help, please." Max's flashlight flickered, and for a split second, he saw them. Figures standing in the corner of the room. They were translucent, their forms distorted and faint, but their faces were clear. Students, teachers, he couldn't tell which, but they all looked terrified, frozen in a moment of terror. His pulse quickened. The whispering grew louder until it filled the room. The figures moved toward him, their eyes wide with fear, their mouths opening as if to speak, but no words came out. Max stumbled backward, his breath caught in his throat. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so rapidly that he could see his breath mist in front of him. He turned and ran, his footsteps loud against the floor, but the whispers followed him, echoing through the hallways. Chapter 4, The Deeper Layers. Max thought he had seen the worst, but as he pushed through the corridors, the building seemed to become more twisted. The room shifted, the layout of the school no longer making sense. He passed through the same hallways repeatedly, the doors now leading him into unfamiliar places. He could feel the building pulling him deeper into its core, and with each step, the atmosphere became more oppressive. In one classroom, he saw the ghostly figure of a teacher standing by the chalkboard, writing something that he couldn't understand. Her back was turned, but as Max approached, the chalkboard appeared to crack, and the writing became clearer. "You shouldn't be here." Max froze in his tracks. His heart hammered in his chest as he realized that the ghostly figures weren't just memories, they were warnings. The school didn't want him here. It didn't want anyone here. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash. Max whipped around, his mind racing. Panic set in as he tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. He backed away, only to find himself standing in another classroom, a classroom that looked exactly like the one he had just left. It was as though the walls themselves were closing in on him. Then he heard it, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway. Max's breath caught. He wasn't alone. Chapter 5, The Lost Souls. Max ran, his footsteps loud against the wooden floors, his body shaking with fear. He had to find the exit. He had to get out before it was too late. But the school seemed to shift around him, its hallways twisting like a labyrinth. Doors led to more rooms that looked exactly the same. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Help us. Don't leave us. Stay with us." He turned down a hallway, hoping for an escape, but instead, he stumbled into what appeared to be a gymnasium. The floor was covered in dust, the basketball hoop bent and rusted. And there, at the center of the room, stood a large, cracked mirror. Max approached cautiously, his reflection distorted in the glass. But then, something else appeared beside him. A figure, a boy in a school uniform, his face twisted in anguish. Max's heart stopped. The boy reached out to him, his mouth moving, though no words came. Max backed away, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The room darkened. The whispers turned into screams. Max realized with a cold, sinking dread that he wasn't just seeing the spirits of the past. He was becoming part of them. The school wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was a prison, a place that trapped souls, forcing them to relive their final moments over and over again. As the door behind him slammed shut, Max turned to face the mirror one last time. He saw not just the boy, but dozens of faces now reflected back at him, all of them pleading for release. The school had claimed him. Chapter 6, The Final Moment. Max tried one last time to break free, but it was no use. The school had already consumed him. His body felt cold and stiff, and the world around him blurred. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was his own face, distorted, pale, and full of terror, reflected in the mirror. He had become one of the lost souls, forever trapped within the walls of the forgotten school. and the building, now satisfied, fell silent once more. Story 5. The Specter's Bargain. Chapter 1. The Flea Market Find. Daniel Owens had never been a successful artist. He had spent years in a cramped studio apartment, struggling to make ends meet. His paintings were dark and abstract, often filled with swirling colors and distorted forms. Critics didn't understand him. Galleries ignored him. The art world had no room for a man like him, until one fateful day when he stumbled upon something that would change his life forever. It was a rainy Saturday afternoon when Daniel wandered into the local flea market. He had been there countless times before, hoping to find something, anything, that would help him in his work. As he passed through the aisles, dodging crowds of people huddled under umbrellas, his gaze fell on an old wooden stall tucked away in the corner of the market. There, among stacks of yellowed books and vintage trinkets, was a box of old art supplies. A peculiar glint caught his eye. It was a paintbrush, unlike any he had ever seen. Its handle was worn and smooth, with intricate carvings along its length. The bristles were long, almost ethereal, and seemed to shimmer as though alive. It was beautiful, ancient, and irresistible. The vendor, a thin man with a crooked smile, noticed Daniel's gaze. "It's an old one," he said in a raspy voice. "Been in my family for generations. A special brush. They say it has a way of bringing things to life." Daniel, skeptical but intrigued, picked it up. The brush felt warm in his hand, and a strange energy pulsed through him. It was as though the brush had chosen him. He hesitated for a moment before handing over the money and leaving the market with the brush tucked carefully in his bag. That night, in his studio, Daniel set the brush down on his desk and stared at it. It felt almost too important to use, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that it was meant for him. He grabbed a canvas and dipped the brush into his paint. Chapter 2. The First Painting. The moment Daniel touched the canvas with the strange brush, something extraordinary happened. The colors bled into one another in ways he had never been able to achieve before. The brush seemed to move on its own accord, guided by some unseen hand. His strokes were perfect, the form coming to life effortlessly. Within hours, his first painting, a chaotic landscape filled with swirling clouds and turbulent waves, was complete. Exhausted but exhilarated, Daniel stood back and admired his work. It was his best piece by far, an embodiment of everything he had hoped to express. The colors seemed to pulse, vibrant and alive, as if the painting was breathing. He smiled, convinced that his luck had finally changed. He had found the secret to success. The next morning, Daniel's phone rang. A local gallery owner had seen one of his paintings hanging in a cafe and wanted to feature him in an exhibition. Within a week, the art world was abuzz with praise for his work. Critics hailed him as a prodigy, and offers for commissions flooded in. The fame, the money, the recognition, everything Daniel had longed for was suddenly within his grasp. But as the days went on, he began to notice something strange. Chapter 3. The Haunting. One evening, As Daniel was preparing to sell another painting, he heard a faint tapping at his door. He opened it to find a man, disheveled and terrified, standing on his doorstep. The man looked as though he hadn't slept in days. "Please," the man begged, "you have to stop painting. I don't know what you've done, but my wife, she's gone. She's not who she was anymore." Confused, Daniel stepped back. "What do you mean?" The man's eyes were wide with fear. "It was the painting, the one you made of the woman on the cliff, with the waves crashing beneath her. I saw it in a gallery. When I went home, I found my wife standing by the window, staring out. Her eyes, she wasn't herself. And then she disappeared. Please, you have to stop." Before Daniel could respond, the man turned and fled, disappearing into the night. Shaken, Daniel returned to his studio, his mind racing. He tried to dismiss the encounter as some sort of coincidence, but the unease lingered. That night, he sat in front of his latest painting, a serene landscape of a small town bathed in twilight. He had painted it with the same brush, the same ease. As he studied it, he noticed something eerie, a figure standing in the background, its face hidden in shadow. It looked out of place, as though it didn't belong in the peaceful scene. Suddenly, the lights flickered. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as the figure in the painting shifted, its form becoming clearer, more defined. The figure's face twisted into a grotesque smile, its eyes glowing with malevolent energy. Before Daniel could react, the figure leapt from the canvas, a phantom image that dissolved into thin air. The room went cold, and a deep, guttural voice echoed in the silence. "You have summoned us. Now we are free." Chapter 4. The Price of Success. Daniel's success continued to grow, but so did the horrors connected to his paintings. Each new piece, no matter how beautiful, seemed to come alive in ways he could not control. He painted a horse galloping across a meadow, and the next morning he received a call about a stampede that had killed several people in a nearby town. He painted a serene portrait of a woman, only to learn the next day that the woman had vanished without a trace. Every painting he created brought him accolades and praise, but at a terrible cost. The spirits bound to the brush, angry and vengeful, haunted those who admired his work, claiming their lives one by one. The more Daniel painted, the more the spirits seemed to grow restless. He began to lose sleep, unable to escape the whispers that followed him wherever he went. The voices from his paintings haunted his dreams, calling him, begging him to create more. But despite the fame and fortune, Daniel knew he had to stop. Chapter 5. The Final Bargain. One night, in a fit of desperation, Daniel locked the brush in a drawer and swore never to use it again. He threw away his canvases and tried to return to a normal life, but the guilt gnawed at him. The spirits wouldn't let him go. His once peaceful apartment became a prison, the paintings on his walls twisting and contorting in ways that disturbed him. The whispers grew louder, and the figures in the paintings grew more terrifying. Then, One evening, the brush appeared on his desk. It was as if it had been waiting for him, its bristles flicking to life, calling him back to its grip. Daniel's hands trembled as he picked it up. The voice from the painting, the same voice he had heard months ago, spoke again. "You have brought us here. Now you must finish what you began. One final masterpiece, and then you will be free." Daniel didn't understand, but he knew there was no escaping the brush. The spirits had taken everything from him, his peace, his sanity, and now they wanted something more. He dipped the brush into the paint and began to work. As he painted, the room seemed to warp around him, the walls stretching, the shadows creeping closer. The brush moved faster than his hands could keep up, the paint flowing freely, as though it had a life of its own. The figure on the canvas, his own image, began to take shape, its eyes filled with dread. The spirits demanded a price, and Daniel knew what it was. They wanted his soul. As the final stroke of paint fell onto the canvas, the spirits swarmed him, their cold fingers wrapping around his body, pulling him into the painting. His last scream echoed through the studio, but it was swallowed by the canvas, leaving nothing behind but his empty, lifeless form. The brush, now stained with his essence, fell to the floor, and the world outside continued, unaware of the artist who had made a bargain with the specters and lost everything. Chapter 6. The New Artist. Weeks later, a new painting appeared in the local gallery, a portrait of a man, pale and hollow-eyed, with an expression of utter despair. The painting captivated everyone who saw it, its haunting presence drawing crowds from across the country. No one knew who the artist was, but the whispers had already begun. The brush was still out there, waiting for someone else to pick it up. Story 6. The Silent Town. Chapter 1. The Call. Eva Carrington had always been intrigued by mysteries. It was what drove her career as a journalist, uncovering the untold stories, peeling back the layers of the world's strange and unexplained phenomena. But the case of the vanishing town had shaken even her. The town of Black Hollow, once a thriving, tight-knit community, had been deserted for nearly a week. No one knew what happened to its residents. No bodies, no signs of struggle, not even an evacuation. The streets were silent, the houses empty, and the local businesses locked up as though the inhabitants had just vanished overnight. The authorities were baffled, and even the locals from nearby towns had no answers. What could have caused a town of hundreds of people to disappear without a trace? Eva had received an anonymous tip with a chilling piece of evidence, a voicemail from the town's mayor, one of the few remaining voices to be heard. The mayor's words were sharp, desperate, and full of dread. "Don't let the night come." Eva knew this was her chance to uncover the truth. She packed her things, grabbed her camera, and drove the 3 hours to Black Hollow, eager to solve the mystery, even if it meant risking everything. Chapter 2. The Arrival. As Eva drove into Black Hollow, the feeling of unease settled in her chest. The town seemed too still, too quiet. The air was thick with tension, and there was something wrong about the way the trees loomed overhead, casting long shadows across the empty streets. The sun hung low in the sky, its orange hue casting a surreal glow over the abandoned houses and businesses. She pulled up to the town center and parked near the mayor's office. The building, like everything else, appeared untouched, but the windows were dark. Eva stepped out of her car, her boots crunching against the gravel as she approached the door. Before she could turn the handle, a voice stopped her. "Eva Carrington?" She spun around to see a man standing in the doorway of a nearby building. His clothes were disheveled, and his eyes were wild, like a man who hadn't slept in days. "I'm Jack," he said, his voice hoarse. "I've been trying to reach you. You shouldn't be here. It's too dangerous." Eva's heart raced. Dangerous? What happened here? Jack looked over his shoulder nervously, as if expecting someone or something to emerge from the shadows. He motioned for her to follow him into the building. As they stepped inside, the oppressive silence of the town seemed to press in on them. The lights flickered, and the air felt cold. "The night," Jack whispered. "It's coming. You have to leave before it gets dark." Eva's curiosity surged. What happened to everyone? Why are they gone? Jack ran a hand through his unkempt hair, clearly agitated. "I don't know. 1 minute, everything was normal. People going about their day, kids playing outside. Then, the sun started to set. And when it did, everything changed. People vanished. It was like they were swallowed up by the shadows. I've been trying to get out, but something won't let me. You can't stay here tonight. You don't understand. Whatever is behind this, it only comes when the night falls." Eva's mind raced. She had to know the truth. "You said the mayor left a message. What did he mean by, 'Don't let the night come'?" Jack's face turned pale. "I don't know, but I heard it too. That's why I'm still here." The mayor was the last one to leave a message. Before he vanished, he said that the night is when it all begins. He said if we didn't leave before the sun set, we'd all be trapped. But nobody listened. The sound of distant footsteps echoed down the hallway, and Jack stiffened. "I've got to go. You need to leave now." Before Eva could protest, Jack turned and hurried down the corridor, disappearing into the shadows. She stood there for a moment, heart pounding, before deciding she would press on. She couldn't leave without answers. Chapter 3: The Secrets of the Night. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the town seemed to shift. The once bright, friendly streets now felt ominous, and Eva could feel the temperature dropping as though a storm was on the way. She walked quickly toward the mayor's office, her camera ready. The building's heavy wooden door creaked open with an eerie groan, and Eva stepped into the dim interior. Dust covered everything, as though the building had been abandoned for much longer than a week. The mayor's desk was cluttered with papers, and an old-fashioned telephone sat in the corner. But what caught her attention was a black and white photograph pinned to the wall. It showed a group of people, town officials, townsfolk, children, all smiling in front of the mayor's office. The image was decades old, But Eva noticed something strange. In the background, there was a shadow, a figure too dark and too indistinct to make out, standing just beyond the crowd. She stared at it for a long moment before her eyes were drawn to the desk, where a stack of old notebooks and journals lay scattered. Picking one up, she flipped through the pages. The entries were strange, describing a series of events leading up to the town's disappearance. One entry, dated just 2 days before the mass vanishing, sent a chill down her spine. The darkness is spreading. People are disappearing from their homes. The mayor warned us to leave before the night falls. But it's too late. Whatever is coming, it's already here. I can feel it watching us from the shadows. Eva turned the page, but the words became more frantic and incoherent, as if the writer had lost their grip on reality. She continued reading until she came across a map of Black Hollow. There was an X marked in the center of the town, next to the lake. Suddenly, she heard a door slam behind her. Eva whirled around, but there was nothing there. Her breath caught in her throat as the lights flickered again, and she heard a faint whisper in the air. "Don't let the night come. Don't let the night come." Chapter 4. The Shadows at Dusk. Eva grabbed her camera and rushed out of the mayor's office, her pulse racing. The sky was nearly dark now, the last traces of daylight fading. She headed toward the lake, following the map's instructions. Her mind raced with thoughts of Jack's warnings and the sinister messages in the journal. What was the connection between the disappearing people and the night? As she neared the lake, the silence was broken only by the sound of her footsteps crunching against the gravel path. The water was dark, almost black, and there was no breeze. No birds. It felt wrong. Then she saw it. At the edge of the water, standing still as stone, was a figure, shrouded in shadow. Eva froze. The figure didn't move, but she could feel its presence, like it was waiting for her, watching her every move. Suddenly, the air grew colder. The world around her seemed to blur as darkness enveloped the town. She turned, heart pounding, and saw the shadows of people, shapes moving across the streets, their eyes glowing faintly. They were coming for her. She turned back to the lake and saw that the figure had moved closer. It was tall, unnaturally so, with elongated limbs and a face that seemed to shift with every glance. It was not human. Eva's breath caught in her throat. She had to get out. She turned and ran, but the path back to town seemed endless, the shadows closing in on her from all sides. Chapter 5. The Final Hour. The town was no longer just quiet. It was suffocating, oppressive, as if the very air had turned to stone. The darkness around her pressed in, and Eva could hear the whispers again. "Don't let the night come. Don't let the night come." Eva knew the truth now. The town had been consumed by whatever malevolent force lurked in the shadows. Something ancient and far beyond human comprehension. It had taken the residents, and now it wanted her. With the night fully descended, Eva realized her only hope was to get to the town's church, the only place she hadn't yet searched. It was said that the mayor's family had once guarded a secret about the town's founding, a secret connected to the darkness that had begun to reclaim Black Hollow all those years ago. But as she reached the church, Eva heard something that froze her in her tracks, a voice, soft and desperate. "Eva, don't let the night come. Please." It was Jack. Before she could respond, the world around her darkened completely. The shadows swallowed everything, and then there was nothing but silence. Epilogue: The Vanishing. The next morning, the town of Black Hollow was gone, completely erased. There were no traces of Eva, Jack, or anyone else who had dared to step into its cursed streets. The only thing left was an old voicemail on the town's abandoned phone line. "Don't let the night come," and the faintest echo of whispers that lingered in the wind, calling out to those brave enough to listen. Story 7. The Forgotten Clock Tower. Chapter 1. The Inheritance. Maggie Moore had always admired the old estate that belonged to her grandfather, though it had been many years since she last visited. Now, standing in front of the weathered stone gates, she felt an odd mix of nostalgia and apprehension. Her grandfather had passed away 3 weeks ago, leaving her the entirety of his estate, including the mysterious, decaying clock tower on the hill. The house was magnificent in its dilapidation, a grand manor surrounded by lush, unkempt gardens, but it was the clock tower that always intrigued her. Maggie remembered her grandfather's warnings. He'd never let anyone near it, telling her it was broken, useless, even dangerous. When the lawyer called her to inform her of her inheritance, he was cryptic in his description of the estate, mentioning the clock tower specifically. It seemed that her grandfather had a particular fondness for it, even in its broken state, and Maggie was left with a haunting sense of curiosity about the structure. She took a deep breath and pushed open the heavy front door, greeted by the scent of old wood and dust. The house was unchanged since her last visit, though a chill seemed to linger in the air, as if the house itself had been waiting for her. Chapter 2. The Clock Tower. Maggie spent the first few days settling into the house, going through her grandfather's belongings, but it wasn't long before her attention returned to the clock tower. Its looming presence on the hill, just beyond the garden, called to her. She knew she had to go inside to uncover the secrets her grandfather had guarded for so many years. One crisp evening, she bundled up against the chill and made her way toward the tower. The door creaked as she pushed it open, the darkness within swallowing her. The room was filled with the musty smell of old wood and metal. The clock mechanism was enormous, its gears rusty and long and used. The face of the clock, however, caught her attention. It was cracked and faded, but there was a strange inscription on the bottom of the clock's face. At the 13th stroke, the gate shall open. Puzzled, Maggie ran her fingers over the inscription. Why had her grandfather left such a message? What did it mean? She stepped closer to the mechanism, examining the intricate gears that had long since ceased to turn. The hands of the clock were frozen just before midnight. Before she could investigate further, A distant sound echoed through the tower, the clock striking. 1, 2, 3, 11, 12. Then a final, deep, resounding 13th chime. The ground beneath her trembled, and the room seemed to warp around her. A surge of cold air whipped past her face as the walls cracked open with a deafening groan. The air became thick, dark, and oppressive. Maggie stumbled backward, heart racing, and the next moment, she was staring into a swirling vortex of shadows and light. An open portal, far darker and deeper than anything she could have imagined. From the portal, something reached through, a long, twisted hand that scraped against the stone floor, followed by a voice, a whisper that seemed to come from all directions at once. "Welcome, Maggie Moore. You belong to us now." Chapter 3, The Entities Beyond. Maggie's heart pounded as she backed away from the portal, the words of the voice echoing in her mind. The hand from the other side retreated, but the portal remained open, pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. Panic surged through her, and she ran to the door, slamming it shut behind her. The air in the tower was now thick with the scent of decay, and Maggie could hear strange whispers reverberating through the walls. Something had come through, something that didn't belong. She had to find a way to close the portal before whatever had passed through could reach her world. She spent the next few hours poring over her grandfather's journals and letters, desperate for answers. The pages were filled with bizarre sketches and cryptic phrases, but one entry stood out. "The clock is the key. It opens the rift between worlds. It strikes 13 at midnight, and with it, the doorway. Only the clock can seal it again." Maggie's hands shook as she read the words. Her grandfather had known. He had known all along what the clock tower was capable of, and now it was up to her to fix it, to prevent the entities from crossing into her world. Chapter 4, The Toll of Time. The next night, Maggie returned to the clock tower, her nerves on edge. The portal was still open, its dark energy pulsing with an eerie, hypnotic rhythm. She could hear faint scratching sounds coming from the other side, like something trying to claw its way through. She knew that the clock needed to be repaired, but how? The intricate mechanism had been broken for as long as she could remember. The gears were rusty, the springs snapped, and the hands were frozen in place. But then, something caught her eye, an old, tarnished wrench on the floor, partially buried beneath a pile of dust. It was strange, but something told her to pick it up. She began to work on the clock, her fingers trembling as she turned the wrench, tightening bolts and realigning gears. The clock responded, creaking to life, its hands slowly starting to move. With each turn of the gears, the air grew colder, the portal's presence stronger. Maggie's heart raced. She had to finish. At the stroke of 12, the portal began to pulse with a terrible, rhythmic intensity. Maggie felt a pull, an undeniable force trying to drag her into the swirling darkness. But she kept working, turning the wrench, aligning the gears one last time. The clock struck 13. The ground shook violently. The vortex howled, a deafening scream that filled the entire room. Maggie's heart stopped as the entities on the other side began to reach through, long, twisted limbs scraping against the stone. Then, with a final, desperate effort, Maggie twisted the wrench, and the clock's gears locked into place. The sound of the 13th chime echoed through the tower, and the portal suddenly snapped shut with a violent shockwave that sent Maggie sprawling to the ground. Chapter 5: The Aftermath. When Maggie awoke, the tower was silent. The portal was gone. The air was still. And for the first time since she'd inherited the estate, there was a sense of peace. She stood up, her body aching, and glanced at the clock. Its hands were still, but the inscription on its face had changed. The gate has been sealed. The clock has reset. Maggie took a deep breath, her eyes filled with a mix of relief and dread. She had done it. She had stopped the entities from entering her world. But she knew, deep in her soul, that the clock would strike 13 again. It always did, and when it did, the portal would open once more. But next time, Maggie wasn't sure if she would be able to stop it. The forgotten clock tower would always be there, waiting. And so would the darkness beyond. Epilogue: The Watcher. Years passed, but Maggie never left the tower. She had taken up residence in her grandfather's house, spending her nights in the tower room, watching the clock's hands. She knew the entities would return, and when they did, she would be ready. But one evening, as the clock began to tick toward midnight, Maggie noticed something strange: the shadow of a figure standing in the doorway. It was her grandfather, or what remained of him. He had been there all along, a silent witness to the tower's dark power. And now, he too waited for the clock to strike 13 once more. Story 8: The House of Whispers. Chapter 1: The Task. Rebecca James had seen her fair share of houses that were difficult to sell, but nothing had prepared her for the mansion on Blackthorn Hill. As a real estate agent for the prestigious Lark and Brantley Realty, she was used to dealing with properties that were challenging for various reasons: location, price, or perhaps outdated decor. But this house was different. The mansion had been on the market for years, and every buyer who had shown any interest had quickly backed out, often with vague excuses. No one seemed to want to go near it. The property's reputation had become the stuff of local legend, haunted, cursed, and, most disturbingly, alive. Rebecca had heard the rumors. The house was built in the late 1800s by the wealthy Hargrave family, but after a series of tragic deaths, it had been abandoned. Over the years, the mansion had decayed, its once grand walls sagging and crumbling, the windows boarded up, the doors sealed. No one had dared to live there in generations. And yet, as the top agent in the agency, Rebecca had been tasked with selling it. Her boss, Mr. Lark, had been insistent. "You'll have to do something with it, Rebecca. No one else has managed to make any headway. If you can't sell it, we may have to lower the price significantly. We can't keep it on our books forever." Rebecca wasn't one to back down from a challenge. Despite the rumors, she saw the potential. Blackthorn Hill was a prime location, with breathtaking views of the valley below. If only someone could see past the mansion's eerie reputation, it could be a great home, or at least that was the story she would sell. Chapter 2. The First Visit. The day Rebecca arrived at the mansion, the sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the imposing structure. It was even more intimidating up close. The house seemed to grow darker the closer she got, as if it were watching her, waiting. The gate creaked loudly as she pushed it open, stepping into the overgrown garden. Weeds had overtaken the path, and the once beautiful stone fountain was cracked and dry. As she made her way up the front steps, she felt a shiver crawl up her spine. The house loomed over her like a giant, its windows dark, its doors shut tight. Taking a deep breath, Rebecca rang the bell. A moment later, the door opened by itself with a slow, groaning sound. No one was there. "Hello," she called out, stepping into the dimly lit hallway. The air was thick with dust, and the scent of mildew was strong. She took a step inside, and immediately she heard it, the whispers, soft, barely audible voices that seemed to come from every direction. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but the voices were too clear, too insistent. "Help me. Get out. It's too late." Rebecca froze, her heart racing. She had heard about the house's strange sounds, but hearing them in person was another matter entirely. Still, she refused to be intimidated. She had a job to do. "Hello? Is anyone here?" she called again. The house answered with silence, the whispers fading into the background. Chapter 3. The Secrets of the House. As Rebecca explored the mansion, the whispers seemed to grow louder, more distinct. They followed her, speaking in soft voices, some pleading, others warning. She reached the grand staircase, the banister carved with intricate designs, each one twisted into shapes that almost seemed alive. The mansion felt strange, alive. Somehow, it wasn't just the whispers. There was a presence in the air, an energy that vibrated through the walls. The temperature shifted as she walked, growing colder the deeper she ventured. The kitchen was filled with old, tarnished appliances, yet the cabinets were strangely well stocked with untouched cans and bottles. The dining room was grand, though the chandelier above flickered on and off, as if responding to her presence. But the more Rebecca explored, the more she felt something was watching her, something just beyond her sight. When she entered the study, she noticed a peculiar bookshelf against the far wall. Upon closer inspection, it seemed to be slightly ajar. Curiosity piqued, Rebecca pulled the shelf open. Behind it was a narrow door, barely wide enough for her to fit through. The whispers were louder now, frantic, almost as if they were urging her not to go any further. But she ignored them, stepping through the door into the darkened corridor beyond. Chapter 4. The House Feeds. The corridor stretched on for what felt like miles. As Rebecca walked deeper into the maze-like passageways, the house seemed to shift around her. Rooms appeared and disappeared, like pockets of reality that folded in on themselves. The whispers came from every direction, growing more intense with each step she took. She could hear voices now, speaking in different languages, murmuring memories of lost loves, broken hearts, and old regrets. The house seemed to be drawing on the emotions of the past, feeding off the energy of those who had lived here. It was as though the very walls were alive with sorrow, greed, and fear. Rebecca reached a door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar. She hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. Inside was a room unlike any she had seen, a library with shelves full of old books and papers. But what caught her attention was the large, ornate mirror that stood at the center of the room. As she approached, she saw something in the reflection, a figure standing behind her. She spun around, but there was no one there. The whispers grew louder, and suddenly, the house seemed to tremble. The figure in the mirror moved, its eyes hollow, its expression one of pure torment. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered, its voice echoing in Rebecca's mind. Terrified, Rebecca backed away, but the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside. The house was alive, and it was feeding on her fear, her curiosity, her memories. Chapter 5. The Escape. Panic surged through Rebecca as she scrambled to find an exit. The whispers were deafening now, every voice a chorus of longing, fear, and despair. The house was shifting, its walls bending and twisting, as if it were closing in on her. She tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. She turned in circles, desperate to find a way out. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something, a door she hadn't noticed before. It was faint, almost invisible, but it beckoned her. She ran toward it, pushing her way through the dark hallway. As she reached the door, a cold hand shot out from the shadows, gripping her wrist. "Leave!" The voice hissed, but it wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a scream. With every ounce of strength she had, Rebecca wrenched the door open and stumbled into the night air. She was outside. Chapter 6. The Price of the House. Rebecca never returned to Blackthorn Hill. She tried to sell the mansion, but it was impossible. No matter how hard she tried, the house would never let go. The whispers would always call to the next visitor, the next unwary soul who stepped through its doors. And as for Rebecca, she was forever changed. The house had fed on her memories, her emotions, and now they lingered in her mind, haunting her even when she was far away. But the house was still out there, waiting. The whispers would never cease, and the mansion would continue to lure new victims, as it always had, feeding on their fear, their hopes, and their regrets. The House of Whispers would never let go.